Dr. Jack Bratich of Rutgers drops by to do a deep dive into QAnon, this conspiracy theory that seems to be at the core of much of Donald Trump's support. Check it out, leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Conversations with great minds. We have Dr. Jack Bratich with us. He's the Associate Professor at the Department of Journalism and Media Studies at the School of Communication and Information with Rutgers University. Rutgers.academia.edu is that website. His Twitter handle is jbratich, B-R-A-T-I-C-H. And Dr. Jack Bratich, welcome to the program, and thanks so much for dropping by today and doing an hour-long deep dive with us about this whole QAnon cult and you know where it came from, where it's going, what it is, all that kind of thing. Can we start out by defining terms? What is a cult and what is QAnon?
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, well, a cult, I'm not an expert in cults. I tend to write about conspiracy theories, but I will say that, you know, the difference between a cult and a religious movement is often the way that the kind of the fervor or the fanaticism that's attached to either a single figure or a way of believing in the world. That's how they often get called. But, you know, I would say that, you know, I think QAnon, and maybe we'll get into this, somewhere, you know, shades between a cult and something that's fairly standard in a kind of religious movement, too. But it's certainly the devotion of the adherents is really at the core of a lot of that for a cult.
Would it be reasonable to just?
Sorry, go ahead.
Just by by way of kind of coming up with a layman's definition here, that a religious institution generally has like the Catholic Church, or the mainstream Methodist, whatever, Judaism, Islam, that the basic purpose is to help individuals achieve some sort of union with God or some sort of higher understanding of life. That it's focused on the people who are members of it, as opposed to in a cult, the focus tends to be on leadership, sometimes secret leadership, and the leadership issues commands about how one must think and how one must view the world. And I realize that religions have catechisms too, but that this is shifting the power and the focus from the people to the cult leaders. You think that's a reasonable starting point?
I think that's reasonable. I think how focused it is on the leader actually makes a huge difference. And I think the way that people find their purpose in life only through the commands of a leader, I think, can really be the core difference between a cult and a religious movement.
So to QAnon, where are they on this spectrum, and what are they all about?
Well, it's interesting, given what we just said. It's interesting because there is no leader in the sense of the classic cults. I mean, there is this mysterious figure that goes by the name, or many people go by the name of Q, that have created and dropped clues onto the internet that then people have picked up and interpreted and kind of formed a movement around it. I think of QAnon as a kind of internet-enabled, religiously based or spiritually based Trumpist social movement, born of the internet, but really born out of Trumpism too, with a very kind of reactionary spiritual dimension to it.
Can we break that down a little bit? What is the spiritual part of it? What is the Trumpist part of it? And who is Q?
Right. Well, I mean, there are entire podcasts devoted to trying to figure out who Q is, and so I think a lot of people are really trying to figure out who that might be. What I would focus on is sort of breaking it down more into the kind of political and then the religious side of it. So let's just say that, we'll start with, it appeared on an image board called 4chan in October 2017. This figure Q starts creating these mysterious posts, right, including the prediction early on that Hillary Rodham Clinton would be arrested soon, right? So you can already hear in that the kind of Trumpist lock her up chants that are now finding new expression in this internet arena, and all that Republican obsession with the Obama administration, even after Trump got into office. Right, so part of this is coming out of an already existing culture of fixation on Democrats and locking them up, right? So about a few months later, in August 2018, QAnon believers start showing up at Trump rallies, right, and with images of Q and Q on their shirts, and they start kind of forming more of a something resembling a community, if not an organization. So I think one of the interesting things, I've never heard of a QAnon adherent who's also a Biden supporter. Maybe there's somebody out there that could really change my opinion on that, but for the most part, the Venn diagram of those two communities overlaps quite strongly. So that's part of the kind of Trumpism that is that the Democrats. We can get into the core beliefs of QAnon in a second, but really the Democrats are more than just an adversary politically. They are also a spiritual enemy because of the things they are alleged to be doing. So that's the kind of more Trumpist side of it. Get into the religious side or the spiritual side, right? So the core kind of belief in QAnon, and there are a variety of conspiracy theories that can be attached to this, but the core belief is this: there's an elite cabal that has corrupted America. That cabal is in league with Satan. There's a small secret group in the U.S. military that's ready to expose and fight that cabal. And Donald Trump gives them their blessing and might be the kind of leader of that fight. But that cabal is basically housed inside the Democratic Party. Other theories that people might be familiar with can be hung on this thread, things like Pizzagate, coronavirus is fake, vaccinations do more harm than good, JFK Jr. is alive, and even broader ones. So it's the general template is that there's a kind of new world order, and that the current expression of that new world order is these kind of bloodthirsty Democrats and figures in the Democratic Party who, among other things, sacrifice children, drink their blood, eat their hormones, traffic in sex trafficking with children, as well as pedophilia networks. So that's just a little bit of what's going on.
Yeah, back in the early 20th century, the Tsar of Russia Tsar Nicholas II commissioned his Secret Service to come up with basically something that would justify taking the wealth of Jewish bankers and Jews in general in Russia. And they came up with this Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this phony baloney thing that Hitler hung a lot of his stuff on. And one of the teachings of that, essentially, I'm not sure it was in Protocols specifically, but it was this idea of blood libel, that Jews would drain blood from non-Jewish children and use that for matzah, for the bread that they eat during the high holy holidays. We have about 40 seconds till we're going to hit a break here. Has that just been transplanted over into the QAnon conspiracy?
Yes, I mean, anti-Semitism is at the core of a lot of this, right? Between the blood libel, the fixation on certain families that rule the world, primarily the Rothschilds for them, as well as the kinds of more kind of like secular anti-Semitism around George Soros funding all of Antifa and BLM, right? So the kind of fixation on Jewish control is at the center of a lot of the narrative of QAnon, for sure.
Which came first, the anti-Semitism or the or some specific component of the Q conspiracy theory? Well, actually, for that matter, the blood of the children thing. They never, at least I've never seen a direct reference in any of the QAnon stuff to, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So how does anti-Semitism fit into this, and where did it get injected into this?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that every QAnon adherent is either aware or cognizant or necessarily as an anti-Semite themselves. However, the kind of structure of the narrative is built into it, and I mean, came in, I think, a little later than the original interest in this, which, I mean, it was more of a kind of game almost that, oh, let's figure out who this deep state is and who's going to be fighting the deep state. It was kind of like a secular thing, really, at the beginning, where Q would post these things about, you know, an upcoming mass arrest that was going to happen. And so I think early on it was more of a kind of, you know, more kind of, again, earthly grounded political game of conspiracy, but then began to broaden out more and got to have these kind of more salacious and also anti-Semitic historical frames attached to them around that. So I think, yeah, you know, but it's mutated over time a bit. But really, at the core of it now is the kind of a desire to really almost fight and wage what I think is going to be, in their minds, a kind of spiritual war. I mean, they talk about it this way. But the kind of structure of it involves almost three you almost say like biblical dimensions. One is the Great Awakening. They believe that, like, for some years now, that people are undergoing a Great Awakening to these horrible crimes that have been going on. And then they say what's going to happen because of this Great Awakening is going to be a mass movement to support basically a military coup that they call the Storm. Very grand metaphor there. And that we need to trust in this execution of this coup, which they call the plan, right? So you trust in the plan, and that's what also makes it seem more than just a kind of war game that people were trying to figure out, like, you know, how is Trump going to fight off these deep state figures? But when they put it into this really grand and epic kind of story, then we start seeing more of even the kind of religious inflection to it.
I've read op-eds or articles by people who are deep into gamer culture suggesting that perhaps this literally started out as kind of an online game, you know, a SimCity kind of thing. You know, let's create a reality here. Let's imagine it. Do you think there's truth to that?
I mean, you know, when I first heard about it, it reminded me of those, kind of like augmented reality games that used to be more
Dungeons
for like
and Dragons
promotions. Yeah, exactly. That, and then, they started using the internet, meaning like so promotional things for like Steven Spielberg's film AI. Use the kind of way to do this kind of detective game or online, and it's a way to kind of be a teaser or a trailer for the film. And so I thought, well, what is this film that's about to emerge that people are now playing this kind of investigation game for? But so it could have those origins. It could have started as a prank.
Dr. Jack Bratich is with us about the QAnon conspiracy. Dr. Bratich, you were saying that there are basically three modules, as it were, three pieces in sequence that, by and large, make up the Q conspiracy and Q movement. The Great Awakening, the Storm, and the Plan. Let's walk through those one at a time, if that's all right with you. Tell us about the Great Awakening.
So the Great Awakening is almost like, the moment of revelations. That what's going to happen is that people who have been, blindfolded throughout their lives are going to finally see the truth of how power works, and to see the way that this cabal has, run things for so long, and how now this is the moment where people need to rise up against it. Right. So that was the first phase. And I think this phase is kind of, it hit its peak, I would say, during the lockdown and the sort of quarantine times of COVID, where there was a real spike in March and April. Yes. When people were at home, many of them were worried about the future. Many of them were lonely, and they started going online and finding this world that was telling them that how things really were, and giving them some meaning and purpose, and community, right? And so I think the Great Awakening was that kind of moment where revelations were beginning to be experienced in this way, and now and there was a deliberate effort to try to educate others, what they called red pilling. Other people, red pill your friends, red pill your family, right? Which is to kind of proselytize, convince, persuade, some old-fashioned kind of ways of getting people to be on board with your own belief system. And so that really kind of spiked in the spring and summer of 2020. So that was a great awakening.
So, So with regard to that, the extent to which QAnon has provided people with a sense of community, number one, a sense of purpose and meaning, number two, and outlets for activism, number three. I remember when I was a kid, when I was like, literally, 12, 13 years old, 11 years old, my dad taking me to Republican Party meetings in Lansing, Michigan, where we grew up, and that were in the neighborhood. I mean, we went over to another guy's house, and there was like 6 or 8 people. All of them were men who were like, real active in the Republican Party. And then there were a few of their wives would come along, and it would kind of be more of a social time. I mean, keep in mind, this was the late 1950s, early 1960s, and I'm sure the same thing was happening on the Democratic side. I'd have to ask my wife. Her father was the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Michigan. An appointed. He was a Democrat, political appointee, but the political party, the Republican Party, was giving my dad a sense of community and meaning and purpose, and an outlet to be an activist, making him feel like he could actually change the world. And I felt that through him. I mean, we went door to door in 1964 when I was 13 years old for Barry Goldwater, as part of that. To what extent do you think that the failure of political parties to do this kind of grassroots stuff and just to throw everything from the top down with $1 billion worth of television advertising has created an opening for something like this?
Oh, I think that's right on. I think the parties, I think, a way that much of U.S. society has created a sense of disenchantment and alienation, and so people figuring out where their purpose could be, that could be aligned with some values, which could find also community, which could create a better world, has been, broken up, as people have been distracted, people have been overworked. I mean, there are many things that contribute to the inability to be able to sort of form that kind of world and that kind of life. So I think, that's often been the case, that other belief systems can show up in those moments that might even be anti-democratic in that sense. They're not part of the political system. In fact, they see maybe the entire political system as being part of the problem, and so they look to a higher purpose than the ones they would find in their in their everyday lives or in their civic duties or in their community relationships. I think that's parties are certainly one element of that has created a lot of anxiety and alienation in the world.
And perhaps the collapse of church going in America.
I mean, I'm sure that too. The question is, depending on what those belief systems in those churches did, I think that.
What are the social
also,
forces that are driving it?
Exactly. I mean, I think people don't always need churches for that, but yes, they can find purpose in life.
Welcome back. Dr. Jack Bratich is with us. He is associate professor at the Department of Journalism and Media Studies, the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University, and has researched and written extensively about QAnon. His Twitter handle, jbratich, J-B-R-A-T-I-C-H. Dr. Bratich, we've talked about the origins of QAnon, where it started with this message board, and I guess we haven't gotten into speculating about if there's more than one Q and who Q might be and what the motives are. That would be, in fact, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then after that, I want to get into, we talked about the Great Awakening before the break. I want to get into the storm and the plan. So, but just to start out, what's the best information or the best guess that we have on who is Q or who is behind this, or even if there is one single person who's driving this train?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's the endless speculation, but I think the best sort of recent investigations into this involve the person, I forgot his name, Jim Watkins, I believe is his name, who runs 8kun, which was the shift away from 8chan, one of these image boards where Q appears and makes his drops, or their drops, I should say, their drops.
Is this the guy in the Philippines?
Yes, that's him. Is that basically one of his former colleagues and collaborators, they had a split. His name is Brennan, last name is Brennan, has come out and basically said he thinks, and he has pretty solid evidence for the speculation at least, that the only person who could control the codes, the trip codes they're called, right, to be able to post under Q is Watkins. And the way that it seems like there was a moment where it became, when they split, he could tell that basically there was a lot going on with Q that seemed to be coming from the owners, basically, or the managers of the platform itself. That's the sort of latest, and that's a kind of insider tale about it too, right? About who's sort of operating it now. Whether there were a number of people who were doing it at the beginning, I think what's happened now is that, whoever is involved in it is quite aware of their power over a large network of people, many of whom have their own YouTube, or they used to have YouTube channels, but they have their own channels and accounts that interpret all of these Q codes. So there's a whole range of influencers who are kind of embedded in this. It's not just a bunch of followers, but it's just, it's a number of these intermediaries, too, that I think are worth paying attention to as how a movement is built, too. So it's beyond Q, the individual. Now it's mostly these influencers who are shaping the movement.
So there were, in the late part of the 19th and the early years of the 20th century, there were a number of religious figures who were talking about, well, basically that was the time period. There's about a 40, 50-year period there where the idea of the rapture came about. It literally hadn't been part of Christianity before that, in its modern form, where people will go up into the air and all this kind of stuff. And the and the sequence of things that have to occur before that kind of got formalized in 1974 with I'm forgetting his name, the guy who wrote the book, but the late great Planet Earth, Hal Lindsey. And but since that kind of foundational point, and there were some foundational people, Ellen White with the Seventh-day Adventists, and I forget the name of the guy who started the Jehovah's Witnesses, but there were all kinds of branches that came out of that. But over the years, what has happened is that they've split into 100 different. So now you've got this televangelist with this sales pitch, the prosperity gospel, and then there's this televangelist with the speaking in tongues gospel, and there's and so like now are these like the influencers? I mean, is that sort of a org chart evolution kind of thing, sort of parallel to what's happening with Q? And if so, or even not if so, how many people are involved right now? How many people do you think are, quote, followers or curious, participants with QAnon versus how many are influencers and like that?
Right. I mean, that's a great question. It's hard to track, right? But you can track, I guess, through the number of, views and likes, and it seems to be in the millions, at least in terms of people who are QAnon curious enough to watch some of these more like the bigger media channels within that community. I would say there are probably like 10 to a dozen of these main figures that people tend to gravitate towards, who some of them have daily news shows where they're interpreting the news. They're trying to relay it to the QAnon community. It's not always about just interpreting Q's drops, is what they call them, right? The clues they leave out, but also just decoding the news. And since you mentioned these different, historical reference points, I think the one that I find fascinating that I don't think people bring up so much, because it's also related to media and media forms, and that's Pat Robertson and the 700 Club and the Christian Broadcasting Network, insofar as he was able to understand the power of the medium and to bring his, sort of apocalyptic Christian viewpoint, conservative viewpoint, not just as a kind of way to get a message out, but he created and bought an entire cable network, had, programming during the day, and then every day he would also have the 700 Club, which would interpret the news for people. He also wrote a book called The New World Order, right? He's really tied into some of this kind of long-standing thing, but I think he's one of these precursors insofar as he also understood the power of the medium at the time. At that point, Christian Broadcasting Network, the popularity of cable, the early days of cable TV.
Right. He also made $1 billion. Pat Robertson did. Is there evidence that there are people? I'm assuming probably some of these influencers are starting to get pretty good-sized checks from YouTube or whatever. I mean, is there evidence that there's a financial motive now, like that, like we're seeing, fairly obviously among some of the so-called Christian televangelists, and now we see with these scandals around Jerry Falwell Jr. and Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, that they were just hustlers. They're just in it for the bucks.
Yeah, I think there are a number of folks. I mean, this is also like, when something like this emerges, extra capitalism, comes into play, and people want to come in and make a buck. I think that's going to be standard. I think some of the more major ones are true believers, though, or at least they're spending a lot of effort, and it's hard to tell what kinds of monetary gain they're getting, especially now that so many of them have been demonetized from places like YouTube or deplatformed from some of the major tech platforms. So I think, but there's always going to be, hustlers and grifters involved in this, and the fact that it's hard to tell the difference is precisely part of the issue.
So we have 2 minutes to the break. Tell us about the storm.
Okay, the storm, because I also do want to get to the plan, because that's more about the election, I think. The storm is the belief that there's going to be a kind of massive arrest, mostly by loyalists to Donald Trump, mostly in the military, who are going to unseal all of these alleged indictments, at least 200,000 indictments, which will, definitively prove these kind of criminal acts by Democrats, right? So the belief is that the moment that happens, and we don't know when that moment's going to happen. That's part of it, right? But they're waiting maybe for Trump himself to announce that the storm has arrived. They made a big deal.
It's like the rapture.
A year or so. It's very much the rapture. Absolutely. This is very much that kind of millennial and apocalyptic version of Christianity here. Yeah, for sure. And it's going to be a massive thing, and the world will become a better place. That's the other part. It is this kind of utopic moment. The good will finally triumph over evil, and that's the storm. And right now we're in the calm before the storm. That's one of their ongoing mantras, right? And now it's the calm before the storm.
So have they appropriated Christian mythology in this regard, or is this something that is just archetypal? I mean, is it part of lots and lots of religions? I'm guessing it is.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it's archetypal. Some of them have specifically talked about being saved. So I think some of them have actually gone through a conversion process. Some of them are already evangelical Christian as well. So I think it's both deep-seated but also very specific to now.
Comparing QAnon to some of the aspects of Christianity, and I use that as an example because I think most Americans have some level of familiarity with it. With some of the component organizations within Christianity that you could arguably call a cult. And I'm thinking of some of these televangelists, and I mean, obviously Jim Jones, he was a Christian preacher. There's no shortage of scandal and stuff around them. Is there, if you look at these Christian cults, these religious cults, typically they emerge based on a foundational theology for which there's a broad consensus. Just the basic tenets of Christianity. And then the leader purports to have a special understanding or secret knowledge and imparts that to his followers. And then the followers basically detach themselves from the mainstream of Christianity and realign their personal identity and spiritual identity with this new cult. and cling tenaciously to it, even when people discover that Kenneth Copeland, has a private jet, and or Jim Baker has a mistress, or fill in the blanks, right? But there's still that sense of identity. To what has QAnon missed any of the pieces here? Because it kind of looks like you could just construct this as a flow chart and say you could do this with anything. You could do this around politics, you could do this around religion, you could do this around worshiping nature. Whatever. Is QAnon that conventional?
Yeah, it kind of is, insofar as the worldview is not that elaborate. I mean, there aren't these great texts, there aren't these great writings, and what there are these little clues in coded language. There's some videos, right? Video documentaries, and there are very few kind of core things that people even watch or read together to even have that kind of common purpose. It's really decentralized. It's really a distributed movement, which makes it fascinating in that way. So it's hard to tell what everyone's kind of investment is in this, spiritually speaking, right? I mean, I will say just briefly that one of the interesting recent things that has caused some controversy is the way that QAnon has infiltrated or moved into the yoga community and the health and wellness community around yoga and spirituality. So it's not just it's been a big controversy in that community about how much it has moved in. So that's another story as well, the different kinds of transcendence and spirituality that can be sort of appropriated or moved in. So it's not always the most conventional kinds that we might think of.
That's remarkable. Are there other subcultures that it's popping up in?
I just read something that QAnon is making moves into sex worker communities. I mean, every community can be sort of touched by QAnon. I mean, nothing is really immune unless you're deliberately trying to be aware of it.
Yeah, particularly because it's essentially a secular religion, so you don't have to sacrifice previous beliefs. It's remarkable. Okay, Dr. Bratich, we've got about, I guess, 7 or 8 minutes here until we hit the end of the hour. We've talked about the Great Awakening. We've talked about who Q is or might be, who the followers are, and how they get acquired. We were just talking about how this QAnon conspiracy movement, religion, is starting to infiltrate the yoga community, the health and wellness community, even the sex worker community. It could pop up in any secular or even religious subculture in the United States. But what's the plan? What's the final piece of the QAnon conspiracy theory or movement or whatever you want to call it?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is where it becomes a kind of faith-based movement, because the plan is something you can't know. You just have to trust that it's happening, right? This is where the deep faith comes in even some of the kind of predecessors that you've mentioned, right? The ones who are making prophecies and predictions that don't come true, right? Instead, wrong predictions, unexpected obstacles are all seen as part of the plan. We just don't know it yet, right? Speaking as pretend I'm a QAnon. We can't know the plan. We can only trust the plan. That's their phrase, trust the plan. So what that means then is that, failures become just one more move in the plan. And guess who knows what the plan really is? They believe that Donald Trump is the genius that he is. They call him a 5D chess master, right? He knows the plan, and so all these things that are happening right now around the election are actually part of the plan, even though we might not know the details of it. So this is why, QAnon has also been very active after November 3rd this year, after the election. So I think they have a significant role to play in this post-election time and time of chaos, to link it to other things you were talking about in this show and other shows around, a potential coup attempt or attempt at blocking the election results. And so I think one of the things that QAnon is doing, I've been watching some of these, the kind of videos and podcasts, and listening to the podcast recently, is they're trying to provide comfort and support to the followers right now. This is why they say trust the plan. Take it easy. It's okay. It's happening. It's a salve in that way. It's part of salvation, right? Mm-hmm. It's a moment of recuperating. It's going to be okay. Things are being handled. Don't get worried, right? Stay home with your families. Enjoy life for a bit. Things are going to work out for Trump, right? So I think for me, this fits into a different narrative than what people are saying, like, oh, you know, Republicans are going through the processes, the 5 stages of grief. I'm not sure if QAnon is. I think QAnon might be going through something else, which is the feeling of what it meant to be there on Holy Saturday, after Good Friday and before the resurrection. There's this day where it's neither one, right? And so I think many of them are in this kind of interminable moment of waiting for the grand revelation to happen. So that's one of the things.
You know, it reminds me of Ellen White with the Seventh-day Adventists. But you know, Pat Robertson stepped into that void with Christianity and made $1 billion. Do you think that this is Donald Trump's next big grift? That after he leaves office, he's going to, hint that he actually is who Q says he is, and he's going to start monetizing this base?
I think it would be very shortly. I believe that he will at least acknowledge QAnon more directly and say either that he's been aware of everything and he's been behind the scenes, or at least say that he's a major supporter. And that will be a sign for the supporters of something that they've been looking forward to, right? A major moment of proper, actual, direct recognition. Right now, I think what they're acting on his behalf, whether direct or not, is to create a kind of static and a kind of interference right now, to flood the zone with all kinds of details as a way to do what he, I think, is trying to do right now, which is, you mentioned before, it's not a classic coup in the same sense. It's a way of blocking things from happening. It's a way of blocking certification and ratification. How do you block those? You create uncertainty. And if you can get enough static, and QAnon is producing a lot of static around the election results and election counting, then that's the thing that might end up getting them what they've been wishing for, which is the victory.